Hey everyone, thanks for your time as always. With NASA news updates being blacked out by the government shutdown, I'll continue to go through information from recent pre-shutdown field trips to see the status of RS-25 production and hear more about Artemis II flight plans. And I did get an update this week about assembly and test of the Gateway PPE. There's also other recent news items to go through, the latest on Artemis III HLS schedule concerns, and what a commercial Orion might say about the future of Artemis. We might see the Artemis II Orion move to the VAB on media live streams at the Kennedy Space Center, but right now we can't ask when that might be. A media event planned for mid-October after stacking isn't going to be exactly mid-October. It could be later or it could be canceled. As everyone knows, funding for NASA lapsed with the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st, and the government shutdown continues, possibly through this coming week, unless there's a rare compromise. In the meantime, work continues on the immediate Artemis missions, since much of Artemis seems to be exempted, meaning it continues with NASA employees working without pay. Depending on how contractor payments are aligned, the contractor work and workforce payments may be unaffected by a shorter government shutdown. In NASA's shutdown plan, most of the agency workforce is furloughed, but Artemis is identified as one of the major operations of the agency that is accepted and continues during the shutdown. However, the plan differentiates types of work between Artemis II and III and Artemis IV and beyond. Accepted work for Artemis II and III is to, quote, protect production of elements and related activities, e.g. development, manufacturing, assembly, processing, troubleshooting, integration, testing, oversight, etc., unquote. But work for Artemis IV and beyond that is accepted is only to, quote, maintain processing and supply chain safety, unquote. The devil is in the details, and those weren't communicated. As I noted last week, all that work is blacked out from the public now. For example, Exploration Ground Systems was forecasting that the Artemis II Orion would move to the Vehicle Assembly Building at the Kennedy Space Center to be stacked for launch on its SLS rocket in early October. With public affairs offices closed and staff on furlough, that major milestone could occur with little or no announcements or imagery, except in hindsight after the shutdown ends. NASA was heavily involved in management and oversight of activities across all the programs in the Exploration Directorate. For the government-owned and operated programs, NASA is the ultimate decision authority. The contractors can continue production, assembly, and test, but if there's an engineering question that needs to be escalated, that's one of the points where the agency program officials would be involved. Another example of questions about the details is that the flight readiness review process for Artemis II had already started. It culminates in an agency-level FRR, where an official date is typically picked for a first launch attempt. But the question is, does that process continue unpaid but supposedly unaffected? There was one bit of news during this past week. Lanteris Space Systems, formerly Maxar, is the prime contractor for the Gateway Power and Propulsion element, and they got back to me with a couple of updates on assembly and test, and a new image. This undated shot is courtesy of Lanteris. I'm following up to find out approximately when it was taken. We can see many of the reaction control system thrusters installed, and where one of the rollout solar arrays will be attached. I asked to get an update on delivery of the solar electric propulsion system thrusters. There are two sets, a set of 3 12-kilowatt advanced electric propulsion system thrusters from L3Harris, and a set of 4 6-kilowatt BHT6000 thrusters from Busek. Lanteris confirmed that all 4 of the Busek thrusters and 2 of the 3 AEPS thrusters have already been delivered, but none of them have been installed yet. I think we are looking at the spacecraft inverted here, but need to verify. If so, the aft deck where the SEP thrusters would be installed would be on top. Lanteris also confirmed that the spacecraft was powered up for the first time in September. Hopefully there are more updates to come in the future. The latest estimates we had were for the Redwire rollout solar arrays to be delivered in this last quarter of 2025, and the Government Accounting Office had reported that the work-to delivery date for the spacecraft to Florida was November of next year. Artemis II Watch is going to be hard for now because the government shutdown means that news about ongoing Artemis II launch preparations are mostly blacked out. To repeat, work continues, but we will see little or no updates about any milestones accomplished during the shutdown. However, a week before the shutdown, NASA and Public Affairs held 2 days of pre-flight briefings about the mission at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, which provided a lot of background for events during the mission and before, and there's still a lot to go through. Here are a few notes so far. In the Orion mission evaluation room, the MUR, I asked a couple of the Ecolus engineers about how much they are able to monitor pre-launch activities, and one of the interesting details noted was a test to calculate the water flow rate to help the crew with dispensing the water during the mission. During some past videos when Orion was back in the multi-payload processing facility, I found out there were a couple of commodities that were deferred until Orion was stacked in the VAB. So, after the spacecraft is stacked, and the Orion service module umbilical is connected, and those interfaces are verified, then the 4 water tanks in the European service module and the gaseous nitrogen tank will be serviced. After the tanks are filled, the MUR engineers told me that a flow verification test is run to see how fast the water is fed through the system to the dispenser in the crew module. There's a cue card for the crew that helps tell them how long to hold open the valve to dispense X milliliters of water. So that's one of those tests on the pre-launch checklist in the VAB. The Artemis II flight crew held a news conference on the second day of the briefings last month, and then did one-on-one interviews with some of the media who attended. I didn't get that opportunity, but Eric Berger did, and his October 1st story for Ars Technica of the crew talking about the mission in their own words is a good read. I put a link to that in the description if you're interested. Overall, we were waiting for Orion encapsulation work to finish in the Launch Abort System facility, then move to the VAB, and then be stacked on top of SLS. The last update was forecasting the move to the VAB early this month, but that update goes back 3 weeks to the middle of September, when we got pictures showing all 4 ogive-shaped launch fairing panels installed. The week after that was the mission preview briefings in Houston, and the week after that the government funding lapsed and updates lapsed with it. Under the current circumstances, where a resolution to the government shutdown might take more than another week, we may have to rely on the media live streams at the KSC press site. NSF NASA Spaceflight might catch Orion moving through the Launch Complex 39 area on their cameras, or Spaceflight Now, but we won't get any updates on status during the government shutdown. That will be the case for all the activity during the shutdown, unless NASA management makes and pays for an exception. We'll see. Unfortunately, as I've noted once or twice, what I think of as not enough updates, NASA thinks of as too much. It's unlikely that will improve during a shutdown. Speaking of Eric, he wrote another interesting piece about the HLS situation, coming in the wake of the Senate hearing a month ago in early September, and then the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel public brief a few weeks ago on September 19th. Both talked about possible delays to the SpaceX Starship HLS lunar lander in different ways. The Senate hearing focused on the concern that an Artemis lunar landing might happen after China's crewed lunar landing, perhaps by the end of the decade. That hearing included testimony from former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, who is now an executive for United Launch Alliance in government operations. He said it was more likely that China would beat Starship to land the next people on the moon. The ASAP reported on a relatively recent visit to Starbase and said in the September 19th public meeting that the HLS schedule for Artemis III could be years late. Eric's story for Ars Technica was published on October 2nd. I also put a link to that story in the description. There are a few takeaways from the story, the first one being that SpaceX is already reportedly talking about 2028 readiness for Artemis III, not mid-2027. Although that's still pretty vague. There's a big difference between January 2028 and December 2028. The main concept he reports on as a solution is a derivative of Blue Origin's Blue Moon Mark I uncrewed lunar lander, which hasn't flown yet. Its first launch is currently forecast for next year. The story says that this new Mark I design concept could land astronauts on the moon this decade. That's not that different from what Blue Origin recently promised for the full reusable Mark II architecture, which is also by the end of the decade. So it's not clear how much sooner this version could be ready than Mark II, or, for that matter, how much sooner a Mark I crewed lunar lander could be ready than Starship. The other big question is, of course, who's going to pay for this? The US government has made more investments in HLS as the decade went on, now funding these two providers, SpaceX and Blue Origin. However, HLS is a partnership with industry, and so far industry is investing more than the government. A moon race with China has been a talking point for a few years in Washington, but when Artemis III was created as the first lunar landing mission back in 2019, the goal was for that mission to land by the end of 2024. It was an aspirational goal and was funded like all other efforts besides Apollo, slowly and gradually. SpaceX and Blue Origin are making progress, but so is China, and government concerns about the US not making the next crewed lunar landing got louder this year. Gradually increasing funds doesn't necessarily match with an urgent situation, though. Are the White House and Congress going to come up with more money? The appropriations bills drafted in the House and Senate at least show that Congress is willing to do that. However, there's a lapse in funding for the whole government right now. NASA and another race to the moon are one of many secondary concerns. Even if a continuing resolution were passed, that won't increase funding for HLS. That won't happen unless an appropriations bill clears Congress and is signed by the president, something that hasn't happened in over 18 months. It's unlikely that an appropriations bill for NASA will be passed before the end of this year, if at all. We'll see if anything comes of these alternate ideas, but in the meantime, SpaceX continues to mobilize the manufacturing capacity for rapid production of more Starship prototypes at Starbase and Kennedy Space Center, and next-generation launch pads at both launch sites. All that outdoor construction activity is visible to the public and the media. What is still secret, though, is the Starship HLS development plan and schedule. We haven't heard much of anything from NASA or SpaceX for over a year about whether Starship's readiness to support Artemis III is a concern for them or not, even though mid-2027 is now much less than 2 years from today. It remains one of the big Artemis III question marks today, in part because the schedules for all the elements remain uncertain. The Starship HLS schedule might not be the biggest concern, we'd have to hear from NASA about that, but it is the biggest question mark today. Clarity on the technical situation is the only thing that will quiet those concerns. A couple of months ago, Orion prime contractor Lockheed Martin started promoting the concept of making the spacecraft a commercial service. The details are thin, and the big question once again is who is going to pay for this? Jeff Faust wrote a story for Space News last week after speaking with Lockheed Martin officials at the International Astronautical Congress in Sydney in late September. The biggest takeaway for me is that this is a strong signal that Lockheed Martin is preparing for a possible Artemis transition after Artemis V, instead of after Artemis III. There are lots of caveats to all that. The White House tried again this year to cancel Artemis, settling on fiscal year 2027-2028 as the cutoff date. That's only 2 years from today, and that plan was based on this same assumption that Artemis III was going to fly in mid-2027. It's yet another reason why there are so many questions about the Starship HLS schedule. If Starship isn't ready by mid-2027, but the termination deadline for all the other programs is the end of 2027, is the White House going to extend all those programs for another year or two to wait for Artemis III at $4 billion a year? Or are they going to cancel Artemis III? And as we've wondered all year, if the White House is going to cancel Artemis III because the price tag for a lunar landing is too high, why continue with the programs now? Congress eventually pushed back on that and kicked the can down the road, as Washington does, by including funding for SLS for Artemis IV and V. But both the House and the Senate included language in their draft appropriations bills for this fiscal year about looking for another off-ramp from SLS, so they are more open to retirement if their conditions are met. One of the primary conditions is a fully demonstrated replacement. There are other launch vehicles in roughly the same class as SLS, but none of them have been certified to the same crew rating standard as SLS through its development. Orion flew one uncrewed flight test on a Delta IV Heavy over a decade ago, but right now it's only integrated with SLS. Making the spacecraft more launch vehicle agnostic is feasible, but not free. So who is going to pay for this? The White House proposed transitioning to another services-based private partnership with industry for crew transportation services to the moon. Would that be enough money to cover the development effort to integrate Orion with one or more new launch vehicles? Another question is how much skin is Lockheed Martin willing to put in the proverbial game? Those would presumably be questions that this private study would look at. Unfortunately, like the commercial SLS studies and contract negotiations, we aren't likely to find out the details. According to the story, NASA would remain the anchor customer, presumably for Artemis, which makes this idea sound somewhat similar to the quote-unquote commercial model that was proposed for SLS. That seems to have died, though, without anyone saying anything. An Artemis VI mission would line up with the second round of production spacecraft builds for Orion, which were ordered in sets of 3. Artemis VI is also out in the next decade, which is a much more realistic time frame for integrating Orion with another launch vehicle, and allows the cost of design modifications and recertification to be spread out over a longer period of time. The story also notes that moving away from SLS, which can send Orion directly to the moon in a single launch, would likely mean going back to Orion's constellation roots. That was a dual-launch Earth orbit rendezvous concept of operations. Way back in 2019, when then NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine had NASA's Launch Services Program take a quick and dirty look at flying a low-weight Orion on another launch vehicle, the mass of the spacecraft was still the big picture challenge. One of the things that LSP flagged was the launch abort system, which is an escape system for the spacecraft and crew, but also the launch fairing. If Orion were to retain its launch configuration, which to some extent dates back to its Ares 1 constellation days, that would simplify changes to Orion, but retains a lot of launch mass. I interviewed LSP back at the time, and they didn't identify any showstoppers, but also said they'd like a lot more time to work through things. That still seems to be the overview today given the same set of crew rating requirements. Feasible, but not fast and not cheap. Even so, this suggests that Lockheed Martin is looking for alternatives to SLS to survive after Artemis V. I'm still catching up on previous field trips. I visited the main L3Harris production facility for RS-25 engine hardware in the Los Angeles area recently, where facility and program managers provided a look at current engine production, but also at increasing the capacity of the facility to increase the production rate. Right after the Artemis II pre-flight briefings concluded in Houston, a set of still images cleared by the company were provided, so I can illustrate some of the things that I saw on the tour. That's the part I'm still catching up on, the report about the tour. However, I can briefly run through some of the images, mostly of RS-25 engine components. The nozzle is the largest piece of the engine, and one of the surprises seeing the plant in 2025 versus seeing it in 2020 is the increase in hardware. The production restart engine passed its design certification review over a year ago in mid-2024, and there were several nozzles in different phases of production this time. This one was getting its coolant tubes stacked inside the jacket. These shots are of another one getting set up for a heat treatment. This shot has someone blocking the view of another nozzle in the same area, but there are two other nozzles nearby. Here's another nozzle in another area. And then going backwards, this nozzle jacket is in the earlier phases of production. It is the 25th of the production restart program. There were also several instances of engine power heads in different phases of production. This is the beginnings of a hot gas manifold, where the injectors and high-pressure turbopumps eventually go. It's the structural core of the engine too, so the main combustion chamber also attaches to it, and the nozzle to that. I saw probably about half a dozen hot gas manifolds being built up into power heads. The main injector and the preburner injectors are also constructed there. Those are smaller elements, but this powerhead, that is closer to being ready for engine final assembly, has those assembled. There were also main combustion chambers like this liner and this, I believe, low-pressure oxidizer duct going through their assembly and production cycles. L3Harris continues to work with NASA to incorporate additive manufacturing into RS-25 production, and there are a lot of machines on the floor, including ones like this. There are also 3D printing applications for some of the Orion work that L3Harris does. In addition to the tour, RS-25 work continues at Stennis Space Center, where the engines are assembled, acceptance tested, and then stored until they are needed for installation. I got an update on that and on reactivation of an RS-25 shop at the Kennedy Space Center, where engine installation in the core stage will now take place. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you find these videos informative and want to find out what's going on with Artemis every week. Big thanks, as always, to the members of this YouTube channel who are helping make it possible to keep doing this. I am posting additional content and updates if you're interested in joining. If you're willing to make a one-time donation to help support what I do, I would really appreciate it. I put a link to my Buy Me a Coffee page in the description. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.